We have a great conversation planned, so let's get started. In today's webinar, we'll discuss the changing market dynamics of healthcare, particularly the rise of digital tools such as member portals during the COVID-19 pandemic and increasing consumerism in healthcare, along with the role that these factors play in cybersecurity. We'll discuss why protecting member portal data is vital for member care and trust, as well as the financial health of your organization. And we'll cover tips and best practices for how health plans and other stakeholders can guard portal data, ensure security, and fend off cyber attacks. Before we jump in, let's meet our panelists. On our panel today, we have Jonathan Shannon. Jonathan is Senior Director on the Healthcare Strategy team at LexisNexis Risk Solutions. He's responsible for the company's interoperability and identity solution suites. Over the course of his career, Jonathan has worked as a strategic, operational, and financial advisor to a variety of healthcare entities such as MSOs, ACOs, health systems, and primary care practices. Also joining us is Steve Gwizdala, Vice President on the North American Healthcare and Life Sciences Vertical and Central Region at ForgeRock. Steve started his healthcare journey in 1988 in biomedical engineering, working with postoperative continuous passive motion medical equipment. Since that time, Steve has segued into enterprise software, providing solutions ranging from supply chain operations, employee enablement, governance risk, compliance, and identity. And our third panelist is Devin Shirley. Devin is Chief Information Security Officer at Arkansas Blue Cross Blue Shield. He has 25 years of leadership experience working at a variety of companies and organizations, including with the U.S. Army and in IT, telecommunications, and health insurance. An extensive background in information security, IT, and telecommunications technology has allowed Devin to champion digital transformation initiatives while making security a priority to better serve members at Arkansas Blue Cross Blue Shield. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today. Let's go ahead and start our conversation. And we want to start today by just talking about recent changes in the healthcare marketplace and the impact those changes have had on cybersecurity. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic initially pushed healthcare mostly online. Telehealth use skyrocketed, as did use of digital tools for communication with health plans and healthcare providers. Much of that increased usage continues today. So we'll go ahead and start there. I want to ask you all, how has this trend, coupled with the rise of consumerism in healthcare, affected member portal security for health plans and their partners? Jonathan, we'll start with you.
Thanks so much. Yeah, no, I mean, it's a fascinating time to be in healthcare, especially around identity resolution. I mean, as you mentioned, consumerism was on the rise even before COVID came through, and people are getting used to interacting with things on a digital setting, whether it be their financials or their retail and everything like that. And so what you saw is whenever COVID-19 hit, it basically put that on steroids. And we always say that it wasn't something that was not happening. It's just something that's happening so much faster than I think it would have happened before. You have this rise of various settings of care. You have these rise of the digital interactions with, like as you mentioned, telehealth, and member portals, and checking your lab results, and scheduling vaccine appointments and everything like that. And so that really has increased, as we reference here, this idea of an attack surface, right? So the more places where you can interact with an entity on a digital setting, there's more places for bad actors to kind of come in and compromise that digital identity, as well as that, and the underlying data that is behind that. And so what we've seen is there's really been an explosion in healthcare, which has typically been a little bit behind some of the other industries such as financial services around digital identity. And now they're playing catch up. And we're seeing a lot of really interesting developments as it relates to that, where people are now not only competing with how do I get you securely to your data, but how do I get you securely to your data in a way that is actually consumer friendly, right? You can't put up all these walls to protect, HIPAA protected data, PHI, everything like that. People are expecting some level of interaction that's actually kind of pleasurable and frictionless because they're used to it from things like Amazon or their banks and things like that. And so really what you're seeing is the proliferation of tools such as our identity proofing solutions and Steve's IAM platform and ForgeRock that are really trying to help balance that security versus the consumer facing ease of use.
Absolutely. A lot of themes that we will dig into today. Steve, let's get your thoughts next.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. I guess to tie into what Jonathan's comment is, one step further is that you'd mentioned that how did it affect specifically the portal, the member portal, and the security with the health plan. And all the items that Jonathan brought up with respect to consumerism and forcing people online, you don't go to your doctor as much in person, you do it all online. The biggest piece on member portal security is it caught a lot of the payers and the providers off guard that it couldn't just be a username and password anymore. And that credentials are someplace that from a member portal security, that they need to really look at that and understand how am I protecting both my member and patient, and how am I also protecting my enterprise. So my view of the world, and to couple with Jonathan's points are all spot on, is that it also really from an affectation perspective really went after, is our portal secure? And if not, why? And how do we then shore that up to make sure our patients and members feel like they're secure? Like Jonathan mentioned, like financial services, we're used to that. We're used to banking online. You're used to doing everything else. And you assume the comfort level that when you type in your credentials or you sign in who you are, that entity is protecting you and you're being protected as you go in. So I think really that changed a lot with the whole healthcare industry, the trend, the consumerism that goes with it is, and I know we'll probably talk about more of that, but I wanted to really emphasize that the portal security for health plans and partners is a vulnerable risk that they need to address and has to be accelerated.
Absolutely. Great themes that we will come back to. Devin, what are you seeing out there?
Thanks, Melissa. I think Steve and Jonathan, they covered a lot of good points in there, and they've got it right. It's the rising need of healthcare to be more digital, to be more telecom focused. Those are where you're working remotely, be it with a doctor, provider, your insurance company, whatever the case may be. And the technology requirements are getting higher. The identity proofing, the identity affirmation, those elements. But what we're also seeing is the regulatory requirements are starting to adapt as well. And now, so we've got mandates for interoperability to be able for a member to take their health information and say, I want to go to this doctor, this clinic, and then have all this information be able passed around numerous locations. So you've got these portals for different entities, for different organizations, and that data has to go back and forth. So now you've got to be able to have that identity travel with them as much as possible. And I think that's going to be the challenge. Is it one identity that goes forward, or is it you have multiple identities based off who you're working with, while still maintaining means of regulatory requirements for auditors, for the government, for HIPAA, everything that's in place. So it's just trying to keep an eye to it, and just that changing market, that changing regulatory environment, along with changing threat landscape and technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. Tall order for health plans, no doubt. We do want to hear from our audience as part of our conversation today as well. So we'll go ahead and move to a poll question now. Go ahead and let's just weigh in. If you're listening, select the best answer that describes your experience. Our question: how has your member portal security plan changed or evolved due to recent and current industry factors? And so significantly, just a little bit, not much, or not at all. So we'll go ahead and give you a moment to mull that over, log your answers. While we wait, I want to ask each of you on our panel to shed some light on the reasons healthcare data is such a valuable target for bad actors. And perhaps we can back up and talk about who's targeting member portals, how are they doing it, and why. Devin, let's go ahead and start with you.
Thank you, Melissa. And the value of healthcare data has changed, and you've heard everything go from a couple of dollars to a couple of hundred. And, depending on which source you talk to, that may change a lot. But one thing's true and one thing is consistent: the data is being sought after. Whether they're able to monetize it effectively or not, they are going after it. And then that's where you really got to worry about the reputation of the organization that houses that data, that maintains that data. And so what it has the potential to do, even if they can't leverage it against an individual, they can leverage it against that health industry, be it a payer, provider, or, whatever their mission is. And so you really got to look at it from that organizational perspective. How valuable is it? There's a lot of crown jewels in there, and it's very important because to their members, that health data is very important to them as individuals. And that's what we have to really be cognizant of. Again, whether they monetize or not effectively or they're relevant, the data's out there. The data could be used for malicious purposes, whatever that is. And so that's where we're really, I think the focus has shifted from how much is the data worth to how can losing that data affect the organization and the trust of the member in that particular organization that was housing that.
Absolutely. Steve, what would you add?
I think, Devin is accurate with all the comments that he made. The one thing I would dive into that, you had asked why, who's targeting it, maybe how are they doing it, and the components that you asked why they're doing it. Medical record numbers are an unusual bird compared to your standard credit card number, for example. If you have a credit card breach, you call the 800 number on the back of your card. They have a fraud department. They get on it right away. They probably decline your number, immediately shut it down, take care of insurance, send you a new card, you're off and running. On an MRN, or a medical record number, that stays with you. And if someone does get in, and why they're targeting a member portal is specifically around insurance fraud on the member side. So if I can impersonate you and I can put fraudulent activity in and get paid for it, that's actually hundreds of millions of dollars, not just a dollar transaction. And that's really what's driving them is how do they actually get into those medical record numbers or username and password into your medical record number in order to get that and actually go as a bad actor against that. And it's a huge industry. It's actually the #1 targeted industry since we cover virtually every industry, but ForgeRock specifically in healthcare, we did a report on it, and it's increased year over year since 2020. And it's the #1 growing segment for capturing not just member portals, but any type of transaction that I can impersonate who you are. And it's just a very, very kind of an old system that once I get that identification, I can use it in multiple areas. And it's not as simple as calling an 800 number and saying, hey, by the way, I have an issue, please shut me down. So I think, tying into what Devin said, there's actually an entire industry set up to go in and find that username, password, medical record numbers associated to you from a healthcare perspective. So it's pretty lucrative for them, not so good for members, patients, and the companies that are supporting them.
Yeah, scary stuff. Jonathan, what would you add to this conversation?
Yeah, I think Devin and Steve hit a lot of the points, and they're spot on with those. I think starting with Devin's point around reputational risk, some of the bad actors here are just looking to ransom organizations, right? They know that they're an organization ending up on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, saying that they had a data breach is bad news for that business, right? Fundamentally in healthcare, we trust organizations to care for us in that capacity. And so if that data is compromised, which is considered incredibly sensitive data, you lose all that trust, and that comes with reputational harm, as Devin mentioned, as well as financial penalties and everything like that, just for the organization. And so I think that's one way to look at it. And then the other thing is, as Steve mentioned, is this idea of it's similar but not the same as financial services, right? So you can't exactly say, what are they going to do with this? Because it's not like a credit card, right, where you run to Best Buy and buy all the flat screen TVs, right? It's you can do a plethora of things with someone's medical identity or healthcare information, right? You can do fraudulent charges, as you mentioned, run up millions of dollars, order pharmaceuticals and sell them on the black market, sell the data itself for tens or hundreds of dollars, depending on what source you mentioned, you believe, right, as Devin mentioned. But the other thing is, there's also these bad actors out there that fundamentally want to know about. It's a little bit more scary if you believe if you read some of these articles around, governmental organizations of other states trying to get information about Americans, right? So genetic information, things like that. So if you think about the kind of data that is behind healthcare portals and housed at some of these healthcare entities, it's incredibly sensitive information, and so you can see why it's being sought after. And as was mentioned at the beginning, because of the nascency of some of these solutions that are guarding it, right? Just username and password, not multi-factor authentication or device assessment or anything like that. It's becoming a very, very ripe place for people to act and try and take advantage of.
Well, let's see how our audience feels now. Take a look at the responses to this poll. So it looks like more than half, 62%, of our audience has shifted their members' portal security plan significantly in the past couple of years. 12.5%, a little bit. 25%, not much. No one says not at all. That sounds like good news and appropriate given the conversation we're having today. So we've talked about some of the challenges out there with respect to member portal security and a little bit of themes regarding how to address those challenges. Let's move into a discussion now about why, and I think, Jonathan, you in particular started taking us there. Why is it critical for health plans and other stakeholders to protect their member portal data? What steps can they take? Best practices can they employ to ensure it's safe? So Steve, let's go ahead and start with you this time.
Thanks, Melissa. I would actually tie back to Devin's comments about compliance, right? So you asked, why is it critical for a health plan and a stakeholder protected? So you have things like CMS operability, you have the HIPAA components at play, you have ONC that's talking about what they do, you have zero trust that comes into effect. All these components, why is it critical for them to do it, is that in order to make sure that they're compliant on their side as an enterprise, they need to lock these down and understand who has access to what and where. And as far as the steps or best practices that you mentioned, it's more than just a username and password now. It has to do things behind the scenes, like, for example, if Devin logs in and he's in Arkansas and all of a sudden he logs in again and he's in Croatia, it's physically impossible, right? And that system needs to understand that's a very simple path, but it needs to things like geofencing. Like, where is Devin normally? Is he normally on this particular Mac machine? Is he on a Chromebook? What's there? And if I don't trust it, I need to have ways to either accelerate that and say, okay, Devin, I want you to now type in your, for example, your mobile. I'm going to send a text to you, and let's validate who it is for you. Very simple piece to go with it, but that's the step in how you understand that the person's data is safe. And there's a bunch of components to that, but looking behind the scenes, and Jonathan talked about this in the very beginning about consumerism. I, as a member or patient, want to make sure I'm secure, but I also don't want to give up my rights that if I log in and I log out and log back in again, that you take it and challenge me for 16 different questions to get back in when I physically haven't even moved. My IP address is the same, my laptop's the same, everything's the same. Why are you putting the burden on me to do that? So to really ensure that it's safe and do best practices, it has to keep in mind not only me as a company, so like Devin at his location, owning his rights of his members, but it also has to take into consideration the member that logs in, that they're not put the entire burden on that member, and it becomes a terrible experience because then we have a difficulty of the member doesn't enjoy it, doesn't do it, it becomes an issue, and then he or she says, I don't want to do business with XYZ anymore because it's not easy. So there's a balance between the two to make sure it's safe, but there's enough friction with the consumer side that they feel safe, but they also don't feel the burden.
Absolutely. Jonathan, let's go to you next.
Yeah, I mean, I think Steve hit the nail on the head, right? I mean, this is where we are today, right, with all these regulations, the Cures Act, right, people having to be able to extract their data. There is a certain evolution in healthcare where we've gone from lock it up, throw away the key, keep it safe, to now we need to have a means, a doors for people to come in, and the doors are expanding every day, right? And so there needs to, as we think about how to have security, you need to have appropriate tools in place, because you can't just open the door and let everyone in, right? This data, as we've mentioned before, is highly sought after, highly sensitive. But at the same time, as Steve mentioned, you cannot make it incredibly difficult. You can't have someone have to, it's not like whenever we were going into doctor's offices where you give them a license or a government issued ID. You can't make people scan that information in, especially as you think about underserved communities and, people in Medicare and Medicaid who might have much more difficult time interacting on a digital setting than some of the, the younger generation or what have you, or people who are more affluent. Right. So at this point, you have to really balance that security and friction with the frictionless interaction. And so I think Steve's example is perfect, right? Which is if they look and smell the same, let them in. But if they start to, if something, you need to have these decisioning tools that allow you to kind of escalate risk. So if, you know, Jonathan Shannon's Southern California, logging in all the time, every day at 3 p.m. on his iPhone, you know, don't bother him. It's probably him. Again, if it shows up I'm in Russia or, you know, China or whatever, like Steve mentioned, kick up the multi-factor authentication, maybe do a biometric scan, make sure it's not a bot, things like that. And that's where you start to have this really powerful next generation tools to fight these next generation threats.
Devin, what would you add?
Well, first off, Steve and Jonathan, they're hitting it exactly right, and I agree with everything they're saying up to this point. And Jonathan, you kind of touched on something I was thinking about, was the difference in society with the different ages and the different levels of experience with technology and those capabilities. And we've got to make sure that we're presenting a frictionless environment to all members, to all patients that are out there. Otherwise, you tend to isolate. And that becomes the real challenge on the security side is, you know, we're trying to secure the latest and greatest technology, and then we have the legacy systems, and you have to keep them in your vision, that customer experience overall. And so it becomes a very operational member, almost a marketing sales experience that where security folks are kind of delving into areas that we may not always be interested in. And so that just continues to escalate the problems that we have. And then one of the other things that we look at is now too, it's not just, you know, a company such as us securing the individual. It's now one company in conjunction with another company with a third, fourth, fifth party, and we're all having to do it together. And so we get this full secure ecosystem that we're having to work together to bring in, because if a fifth party provider has a breach, that could affect the fourth and the third and the second, first parties. And then we all reap the negative benefits of that said breach. And so we have to be very careful in the relationships that we develop and make sure that we're all talking the same language and that we're all doing the same things. And so those partnerships are going to be critical if we continue to move forward. And as it goes from one data center, one element to a cloud-based data's everywhere. You know, if you're looking at Zero Trust, the goal is to really move toward that perimeterless environment. And that's where we start working with numerous organizations across the board. And so it gets complex, but it is the way the world has moved with the technological landscape. And so we have to adapt to that and make sure we're implementing the steps and the process and procedures, both technical and governance, from a governance perspective, make sure we're doing the right things.
I want to pick up that member experience thread that each of you have touched on. Ideally, optimal member portal security is going to be accomplished with no impact on user experience. So I want to talk about how you would advise health plans to think about that balance between friction and risk as they manage security. Let's go ahead and start with Jonathan this time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we kind of, like you mentioned, we kind of touched on it a little bit, but, you know, there is a certain level of friction that is expected, right? As you think about, I'm logging in to get access to fundamental healthcare data, right? And I think it delineates also at the time of interaction, right? So as I'm doing a new account opening at my health plan, and I'm setting up my profile, and I'm entering all this information, and I'm telling them where to send the bills and all that stuff, I am naturally expecting a good amount of friction, right? Because if it's kind of like setting up, you know, you going back to the financial services example, it's kind of like setting up a credit card. Like, this is opening the gate for me. And so I want to get you know, I'm okay with a little bit of friction. Maybe you have to validate my identity or get a government issued ID or something like that. You know, using NIST IAL2 standards or whatever it may be, which means something to me, but probably doesn't mean anything to anyone, to most normal people. But it's like, you know, you can expect that. But as you think about interactions on a daily basis, or whether it relates to checking your bill, or, you know, going to check your lab results, or, you know, scheduling an appointment with a physician or things like that, it's kind of, you want to make it quick, right? And Steve touched on this as well. And you want to make it easy, because if I logged in, I approved all this stuff before, I don't want to have to do it again. And so it's one of those things where, in the various settings and the various decision trees and the various use cases, you can have different levels of security at different points. And as you think about, and that's how I would encourage everyone to think about this is, yeah, try and get frictionless security in everything, right? So things like device assessment, geofencing, where the consumer doesn't even see it, right? They're just like, okay, this is the same person on our end, but you don't have to do anything. But then as you start to think about things that are more onerous, going to this idea of multi-factor authentication, which I think should be almost on everything, to something as aggressive as like, an ID verification or submitting your biometrics. Those things should be reserved more for things that are going to, fundamentally alter the course of how you can access that data. So that's how we're thinking about it, and that's how we're encouraging our customers to do so as well.
Yeah, Devin, what would you add?
Yeah, and again, Jonathan's got some good insight there. And as he's talking, I'm thinking, we expect a certain level of friction. Everybody does. It's kind of like if you were to walk into an airport and nobody went through any security checkpoints, you'd probably start getting a little nervous about hopping on that plane and, what might happen. Same thing here. If I go in and log into register on a new bank website and they're not asking for username and password, hey, what's your account number? We're going to lose a lot of trust. We're going to lose, clients. We're not going to be able to do the business because people aren't going to trust us. So in a way, they want to see a little bit of friction. It's when that friction becomes it inundates you and makes it a tedious experience. And I agree completely. That background process is going to be crucial. If as many checks as you can do, as many defense in depth capabilities that you implement behind the scenes, that's where you're really going to enable a better experience while giving just the right amount of friction. It's like a car. If you don't have any friction, your tires spin. If you get too much, you're going to slam to a stop. It's got to be just enough friction to get you moving forward and get you going and get you to that destination that you're trying to reach.
Yeah, great analogy. Although I will say, after my most recent airport experience, I might want to talk with you further about that. Steve, thoughts on this question?
You had extra friction. Is that what you're talking about, Melissa?
Yeah, just a little. I think a lot of folks are.
So I'm going to completely be in the same boat as Jonathan and Devin, and there's just a couple points that I want to hit home that they both brought up. One of them actually Devin brought up previously, which is the age component. So in healthcare, you're dealing anywhere from 16 to 18 years old, depending on what's there, all the way up to 100 plus. So think about friction. Friction doesn't mean the same to someone who's used to being on their phone and doing everything from their phone to someone who's used to being in person and doing things in person. So you have to have a balance of types of friction points, whether it's on a laptop or a tablet or a computer or a phone. And this goes to Jonathan's point about knowing your customer. It's a retail term, KYC, is doing things like progressive profiling, which is what he alluded to, which is being able to figure out, do I know you? And what are you doing now? So he had mentioned like signing up for, one thing, being able to take a plan, for example, versus going in and looking at medical records are two different things and two different components. So you then, to tie into Devin's comment, you want to have different risk at different levels and different friction points depending on what the member or the patient is asking to do. So it's really like an adaptive risk type component. And Devin touched on this previously when he talked about zero trust, meaning always checking. Trust but verify is really what that means. And throughout the entire process. So no matter what you're doing in those systems, Devin had mentioned, tying into a legacy system or going into the main system. As you open different doors and you go different ways inside the system. So maybe I have my health data that's coming from my smartwatch and that's being aggregated on my portal. Kind of low risk. I mean, if someone knows what my heartbeat is or what's there, probably not a really big deal. But when it comes to what my payments are and what I'm being invoiced for, or what my lab results are, I would think you'd want even more to make sure it is really me and that someone hasn't gone there. So again, just echoing what both Jonathan and both Devin both covered is that progressive profiling, being able to understand what's going on as you go through things, and then adaptive risk as you go through that journey, that customer journey. Where do I really want to challenge to make sure it really is you throughout that process so I don't give you access to something? So I agree with both of them 100%.
Great. Well, thank you, all three of you. I want to hear your thoughts now on the state of the industry. We heard from our audience previously, but just wondering your take. Are health plans doing enough around member portal security? And then where would you say they're succeeding and what do they need to do more of? Devin?
Well, that's really going to depend on each individual organization. I think everybody has recognized the threats. Everybody has looked to the market. Everybody has seen the threat landscape and everything from nation state to individual malicious actors. Everybody's seen it, and they're all taking the appropriate steps they need to within their organizations. How much they do in the specific steps are going to vary based on, how those touch points that they have with the member and what the individual elements are within the various business units. And so I think the efforts are there, and I think a lot of the regulatory requirements are helping to drive that, along with frameworks, risk management frameworks, NIST, high trust, ISO, any one of those. They really help people drive towards that. And I'll just be quite frank, a lot of customer requirements drive that too. You get contractual requirements you have to make sure you're adhering to, and you get enough of those, customers pretty much kind of create an unofficial framework for you by giving you their own requirements. And so you have multiple input sources that are coming at you from multiple places. I'm sure there are areas where everybody's lacking, but there's a lot of areas where everybody's doing well. I think a lot of folks have moved on to the next gen AV. I think a lot of folks are looking to migrate towards a zero trust model. Some are more mature, some are less mature. And Steve hit it really good. He talked about the adaptive risk and then the adaptive access mechanisms that come in place. It's like what Jonathan was saying. Okay, this one person's doing the same thing, same time every day, no problem. Oh, we found something that's a little different than what they used to do. Well, let's throw in one more piece. Okay, we're not real clear about that. Let's ask them for one more. And so you vary those access control mechanisms based on the level of risk that you see. So I think moving that direction is where everybody's really moving towards as we continue to make sure that we're providing a good experience while keeping it secure.
Absolutely. Steve, thoughts from you?
Yeah, I guess to go back to your comment of where are they succeeding, where do they need to do more, based on my view of the world, is that where are they succeeding? I think a lot of the healthcare industry is starting to go to, like Jonathan mentioned, like a multi-factor, which is a good step, right? It's the first step of, hey, who are you? I'm going to send you a text message or SMS or whatever the case may be and log in. But I think where they need to do more is to go all the way back to your first question that Devin and Jonathan talked about and myself about consumerism and that ability to do more as a member and a patient. So what I mean by that is, like, for example, self-service, where I don't have to call the 800 number on the back of the card. I don't have to, no offense, but I go to a payer and a nurse answers, which is great because the nurse is there because it's typically a medical question. But then you don't have a medical question. You have a question of, like, how do I reset my password? Because as you know, in this world, passwords are constantly changing. And depending on your strategy, it could be every 15 days, it could be 30 days, it could be faster. And now you have a list of 60, 70, 80 consumer sites that you go to, and you're rotating different passwords. At least you better be. If you're not, then there's a different issue to talk about, right? But the problem with that is I just don't see in the healthcare space, because they're a little slow to market, that ability of doing things like retail where something as simple as, hey, I want to authenticate, but I also can't get in. I've forgotten my password. How do I reset it without having to call a person or a help desk? How do you validate it's me so that I can actually do that? And the retail world's been doing that for probably the last 5 years. And it's not altruistic. It's because they don't want you calling the call center, because the call center costs them money for every call. But it makes it seem altruistic because they're like, oh, we're giving you the power as the member to do that. So I think you add that component in, and probably the other piece that's been really forced to the front is the CMS operability, which ties into things like the California Consumer Privacy Act, which is a derivative of GDPR, which is how do you share your data? How do you revoke your data? How do you do the right to be forgotten? And all of those components can be tied into identity, where you as a user can say, hey, I'm going in for a surgical procedure. Jonathan's my brother. I want him to have access to my medical records. So I do that digitally. Then John and I have a falling out because he and I can't agree to Thanksgiving location and dinner. So now I revoke his privileges. But the difference is that I have this provenance of trust that goes all the way through and lets the user manage their access and what they do. I think that's where it's kind of falling a little bit short in the healthcare world, financial services is way ahead of this. If you think about your bank, you can give access to view only for your accounts to your accountant or to your broker, and they only see certain things. That's all the ability of the end user to control. I think in healthcare, because of these new acts that are coming out like CCPA or the GDPR component, it's now every state is adopting different ones. CMS interoperability, the CARES Act that Jonathan mentioned, several that Devin mentioned as well, are all tying into how do I manage my data as a member or a patient without having to call the entity to have them help me. So I think that's a little short, but there's room for opportunity for those particular enterprises to be even better.
Yeah, absolutely. Jonathan, what would you add?
Yeah, I mean, I don't envy anyone sitting in a CTO seat, Devin, who has to balance all these priorities right now. I mean, it's so much stuff that's happening. And so, I mean, to answer the question more specifically, I think Devin hit the nail on the head, right, where everyone's recognized there's a problem, right? Or everyone's recognized there's an increasing threat. And I mean, you saw this in our poll questions, right, where everyone is doing something, right? And whether the question now becomes, is it enough? I think Steve's absolutely right, where multi-factor authentication is becoming more and more prevalent in healthcare, which is great. It's a great first step. It actually increases safety and security to a much greater level than just an individual password. I mean, I got an email from our CIO today where it said a laptop can crack a 8-digit code or a password in like 30 minutes. Even if it's got like numbers and everything in there. So like, that's just not safe, right? So now at this point, we have to go to the next level, and multi-factor authentication is a great place to go. But, I think Steve is absolutely right. Consumerism needs to be at the fore of this, right? And you can argue that this is not a core competency in healthcare as we currently looked at it, right? Retail, it's all about pleasing the customer. Healthcare, it's all about making sure the customer survives or, that they live a happy, healthy life. And so is it really been at the fore of people's thinking? And I don't think it's been the case, but now they're starting to come together more and more as you get more digital health out there, telehealth, as we mentioned, a lot of these wellness apps, things like that. People the lines have been blurred a lot. You have people getting into online pharmacy. And so people are like, well, it's the same thing, right? Like my health plan should look like Amazon's pill pack or something like that, right? So I don't understand the difference. And so I think Devin mentioned this at the beginning. I think the area that we really can help improve that is getting to this kind of frictionless underlying capability, right? Where it's, as a consumer, I feel comfortable that you're asking me questions around multi-factor authentication, sending me a code and things like that for my to log into my health record. But at the same time, adding that layer of security that makes my data more secure, but doesn't impact me as harshly as as some of the other things. So I think there's room to grow there for sure, and I think we're starting to see some people adopt that and start to recognize that that's the way to have a more pleasant member or patient experience.
Absolutely, great insights. As we shift to our next talking point, Devin, I wanted to ask you to speak to this first. I'm really interested in your thoughts around moving member portal security forward. Perhaps you can talk about the threats that are most prominent on your radar. And something I think our audience would find very interesting today is tips for getting leadership support for these security efforts.
Yeah, and I think Steve kind of hit up on it earlier for us is, and other companies too, is that fraud. Are you posing to be someone who's a legitimate member, but that it's not you? And I think what we're seeing is that's where you get a lot of these elements on the dark web, where you get numerous members, member IDs, all this health information, all these hospital breaches. They take that and then they just kind of go into brute force attack, copy paste mode. Which one can I brute force their portal account with? Which one's going to be the easiest to get into? File claims, work some fraud. That's really kind of the perspective we've taken on that, and understanding, how we can look at preventing that, or identifying when we have those potential capabilities. We always have, when you look internal to the company, you're looking at ransomware, compromised accounts that enable someone to get to the organization. But when you're looking at customer portal accounts, it's what can they do if they're posing as that customer, and how do we protect our members in that regard. And one's an external in, one's a internal out kind of perspective. You got two different perspectives from an access management side. And so, but you said it there with the topic of how do you get the leadership support. If you don't have the support of the leadership, you're not going to be able to accomplish what you need to. And so it's really gets into a risk-based approach and be able to explain the risk to the organization, not just from a security perspective, but, financial speak to everybody. If you can prevent it from a financial, a sales perspective, a marketing perspective, reputational, that's how you really garner the support. I always tell people you got to be a little bit paranoid somewhat to be in cybersecurity, and people think we're overly paranoid, but that's our job. And being able to pass along some of that fear, the healthy dose of fear, if you will, not so much sky is falling, but understanding this is the risk, this is how it's going to impact the business, this is the level of effort needed to combat that risk if our appetite is there to mitigate that in any way, shape, or form. So just putting the argument together, really understanding the whole business perspective, not just the technical or how it affects just the world of cybersecurity or IT, but understanding the business model and the impact it's going to have.
Yeah, great advice for your peers who are listening. I want to turn the conversation now to LexisNexis Risk Solutions and ForgeRock and how they work together to protect member portals from threats. Jonathan, can you give us some detail?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll let Steve talk about ForgeRock because he's much better at that than I am. But I can talk about, we talk a lot about frictionless consumer or member or patient experience, right? As we think about ourselves as a vendor of identity proofing capabilities, we also need a frictionless customer experience, right? So what we want to do is how we work with Steve and ForgeRock is integrate into their systems to provide best-in-breed identity proofing capabilities, whether it be device assessment, behavioral biometrics, multi-factor authentication capabilities, knowledge-based assessment quizzes and things like that, leveraging our experience and our referential data sets and our risk models and everything like that. But from a customer experience perspective, it's seamless, right? And that's what we want to get to, is we don't want to have them having to deal with me and with Steve and then all of our integration teams and our various sales teams separately and everything like that. It's more, how do we meet your use case? And that's why integration is so important. That's why our collaboration is so beneficial for both us and for our customers, is this idea that can we get you what you need together? Because you don't really care. I mean, let's be serious. Customers don't really care where it comes from as long as it gets them what they need. And that's our job, is to figure out how to make that as frictionless as possible and integrate together and work collaboratively so that we can provide them the best possible outcomes, the best security, the best tools to feed, to build that, that solution that they need to be able to appropriately monitor risk throughout their organization.
Yeah, and Steve, you want to give us the ForgeRock perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with Jonathan. It's kind of like the 1 + 1 = 3 component when we tie the two solutions together. So like Jonathan mentioned, from an identity and access management or identity proofing, you tie the two together. We're concerned about the identity, encrypting it, all the components that Devin talked about, and following all the standards. We're also concerned about how do we add in, like LexisNexis, to make the journey that much easier, but add in friction where necessary. So what we do from a core component is understand who they are, what they are doing, how to either do a password or passwordless, and how do we protect the identity for our customer, in this case, the enterprise, and also for the member or the patient on the other side. So everything that we do from the patient portal is making sure we're identifying you as the user and the things that we talked about before, like progressively understanding who you are, looking at the risk factors that are there. And there's elements, things like we talked about, location, device fingerprinting, all these things are happening in the background that you as a consumer would expect it to be happening because that's the level that we want. But on our side, making it as easy as possible to implement, but also protecting that identity for the portal and then tying in wherever we need to go depending on what's there. So from an identity and access management threat protection standpoint, the two of us together on what we do on the patient portal makes it very customer-centric, but very protected as far as what's happening on the threat side.
Great. Thank you, Steve and Jonathan. We want to check in with our audience again with another poll question. This one, would you like to speak with a LexisNexis Risk Solutions salesperson? So you can go ahead and just let us know your thoughts there. While the audience is filling that out, just want to ask recommendations for choosing a member portal security partner. What would you say is important to look for, Jonathan?
Well, I think first and foremost, are they LexisNexis Risk Solutions is the first. No, just kidding. I mean, I think what you really want to see is differentiated capability. Understand this discussion that we've had today, right? Where it's not just trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, right? Where you, you understand the risk and how it's evolving, but you also know how to balance the best-in-class tools against, against that friction that you're gonna create. It may be necessary, but also could be very fundamentally unnecessary and impact your NPS scores and your ability to recruit new members or patients and things like that. And so that's what I would say is you really want to see, what the depth is, right? Versus, hey, can I get you an off-the-shelf solution that's going to, kind of meets the needs and met the needs for 5 years ago? Let's think about the next generation of solutions that come out there.
Thanks, Jonathan. Steve, thoughts from you?
I would look at, to Jonathan's point, the user journey is what you're trying to accommodate. Devin had mentioned a very interesting point that I had noted on one of the questions about different disparate systems. So when you're looking at that portal from a security perspective, you're going to be tying into different systems, into different things. And how does that identity system accommodate legacy? How does it accommodate cloud? All these different components that you're tying to it. Look at that, which ties me into scale and responsiveness. So we as consumers become very impatient when things don't load quickly, right? And so you really want to look at, when you're looking at the member portal security, is I do not want my identity and access management software to slow the member experience down. So we're talking millisecond response, not seconds response, because how many times have you gone on a website that you've searched? I know I've done it. And I'm like, oh, that sounds good. I'll go there. It doesn't load. I immediately click off of it. I'm like, I'm not going there again. I'm going somewhere else. And so you really want to look at the user journeys that Jonathan talked about, but you also want to look at the security component and responsiveness. And then lastly, Devin had talked about this before, but HIPAA is a big one, is to make sure that, is your data being controlled in a HIPAA compliant capability? Because you're dealing with PHI, which is personal health information, and it needs to be handled a different way than, for example, financial services or GDPR. HIPAA is unique. So I would look in when I'm choosing a member portal, obviously I'll put the plug in. Yeah, it should be LexisNexis and ForgeRock. So I'll add that on to Jonathan's comment.
That part too. Yeah, absolutely. ForgeRock.
Right? But I like how you started that. But I'd also look at the other components too, the user journey, the capability to tie into multiple systems, because no one customer, whether it's a payer or a provider, any in health life sciences, they're not dealing with one system. They're dealing with multiple systems, and they've grown over the years. How easy is it to incorporate, which then ties into my responsive piece. Is it scalable? Are you dealing with one of the really large blues that has 10, 12, 15 million members? Well, it better be super responsive, because if it's not, you're not going to get a lot of people liking it. So I would look at scale, and then last piece is the HIPAA component from a PHI compliance. Is how I look at it.
Yeah, and sorry if I can just jump in there as well. I just want to add to, because Steve made me think of another point, which is unique healthcare capability. Because we made a lot of reference today to like financial services and how that's next generation and everything like that. Healthcare is a unique beast, right? It's a unique animal. All of us know that, right? Being in this industry. And if you don't know how to work with healthcare data and the challenges that come with that, whether it be regulatory or different types of profiles of individuals, as we talked about before, you're going to have a really bad time trying to identify identity-proof people. And you got to make sure that your vendor knows that. So, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's great stuff. Well, really appreciate the conversation thus far. We've covered a lot of ground. We're almost out of time, but we do have a few moments for audience questions. So we'll go ahead and shift in that direction now. If you have a question that you haven't yet submitted, please go ahead and do so. If we don't get to your question on the air, we will follow up by email. So let's go ahead and jump in now. Jonathan, this may be a question for you to start us off with. What data features are most important for a strong referential data set?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, truthfully, it's kind of like asking what ingredients are most important in like getting a good cake. They're all very important, and you need to make sure that you all add them all in appropriate measure. But there are ones that obviously stand out, and you got to be expansive with them. What we see a lot is obviously LexisNexis has been doing referential data for 40 plus years, so we've been collecting data for a very, very long time. A lot of people claim that they have referential data. I would urge folks on the phone to double click on that and pressure test that a little bit. As Steve mentioned, we're dealing with HIPAA data, and as Devin mentioned, we're dealing with all these different types of folks, right? Everywhere from 16-year-olds to 100-year-olds, different people who have interacted with the ecosystem of the public records in various different ways, right? So some people have never even owned a credit card. They've never opened a bank account. They keep all their money underneath a mattress, but they still need healthcare, right? That's fundamental, right? And that's where I was alluding to earlier with, this is nuance that you have to understand healthcare, right? Even if someone isn't logged in a credit report, they still need to be able to identity. They need to be able to work with you. So as we think about referential data sets, one of the things that LexisNexis does that I think differentiates from a lot of the other ones that are out there that claim it is that we also cover underbanked individuals. We think about the Medicare population. As I mentioned, this idea of if you don't have a credit card or you don't have a bank account or you don't really show up on credit reports and you don't really exist on a referential data set. But using other data sources, of which we have over 10,000, you can actually create a very good picture of that person, and you can create an identity for them, and you can say, actually, I see that this address and this address that you've had over the past 5 years, even though you haven't had a bank account associated with it, I can see who you are. And then also being able to strip out that things that are going to mess up the data. So, for example, people staying in homeless shelters, that's not their permanent address. Only companies that have done kind of things that we do will know that, and so you'll make sure that that you're not identity proofing against dirty data, and that's how I would say that's what a good referential data set looks like: expansive, linked well together, and it pulls in data sources that you wouldn't normally think of, so it's not so myopic and it's effective.
Yeah, some interesting health equity threads to those points you've made there. Devin, Steve, anything you want to add on referential data sets?
It's really just kind of around what Jonathan was saying, just making sure, that the master data management approach and just really understanding that you've got good data, that's going to be crucial. And then understanding where it's located. We kind of get into data analytics in our world, looking at everything from social determinants of health. And so we're really becoming more and more data focused. It's just understanding the integrity of that data, making sure everything is appropriate where it needs to be, and we're controlling that data, where it's going to, and what people are doing with that data.
Great. Steve, anything from you?
I think you both covered it very well. No, nothing else to add.
Great. Well, we've got time for at least one more question. Just wondering how health plans should be testing the level of security that they put in place around their portals. I'll throw that to the group. Let someone hop in.
So I'll take that one, Melissa. We always, you hear the term red teaming. That's really kind of the best thing. You can have a lot of the best controls and protections in place, but until you really test it, and not just testing your control, but testing your processes, your response plans, all those elements. What do you do if this happens? What do you do if the worst happens? What do you do if it's just 3 members or three? How are you going to respond? And understanding how you can pivot if things start really going south, and understanding how your organization is going to handle that. And again, it gets back to a risk-based analysis. HIPAA is going to give you requirements if you're more than 500 members. Okay, you got a plan for that. What do you do if it's under 500? Are you going to do, is it that the data was breached, or was it that someone's account was compromised? If so, do we just reset the account, reach out to the member, tell them we think you're compromised? We're just going to reset it, enforce a password reset. What does that look like? And so you've got various scenarios you can play with, and then maybe even if it's just a tabletop that you walk through of how you're going to do that, there's everything you can do to pressure test a process, a technical control, administrative control, and just really trying to work through those capabilities as you continue to improve your capabilities overall as an organization.
Yeah. Great insight. I'm going to squeeze in one more question, hoping we can do this quickly and get everyone out of here on time. Jonathan, will your team be at any upcoming events, or how can listeners who are interested in connecting learn more, see a demo?
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to be hosting a webinar about the true cost of cyber fraud sometime in October. So hopefully we can share that with this group and everything like that. And we actually recently just published a document with EHI around this exact topic. And so those are the things I would encourage people to look for. The other thing that I would say is as you probably can tell by being on a webinar, love to talk about this stuff. If you want to reach out to me directly, I'm always happy to talk about it, talk through things directly. And so I would encourage anyone who's interested in that kind of thing. I'm always excited to talk about this stuff. So absolutely reach out.
Great. Well, I really want to thank you, all of you on our panel, Jonathan, Steve, and Devin, for the insights you've shared today and your time. Thank you to our audience for your interest and attention today. This concludes today's webinar. Have a great day.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you having us. Take care.
Thanks for having us. Yes.